Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream. This is the special star-studded edition of our live stream here today. We're going to cover the topic, digital transformation lessons from 6 experts. And we have 6 people here today that are going to be speaking at our Digital Stratosphere Conference coming up in October in Denver, Colorado, which you can join in person in Denver, Colorado, beautiful, sunny downtown Denver, or you can join it remotely and virtually. So I'll share with you in just a moment. I'll give you a little QR code that you can scan and learn more about the event here in just a moment. But the reason I'm bringing up this conference is because all of 6 people here today are going to be physically there live in person at the Stratosphere Conference. And I thought it was a great excuse to get a subset of the speakers from the conference together to do a fun live stream today to talk about digital transformation lessons in general. So today's conversation is really going to focus on what things make digital transformation successful. We're going to take questions from the audience. We're going to talk about different things that lessons and experiences that this great panel has for us here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO at Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. This interview will become part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. So by being here today, you are part of the live production of that podcast. And you can listen to current and past episodes of that show by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And then once we edit this and add some more content to this discussion here today, this will be released on that same podcast in about 2 to 3 weeks. So again, go to transformationgroundcontrol.com if you'd like to learn more about digital transformations. And last but not least, we are going to take audience questions. So any questions you might have, please drop those in the chat. We are watching the chat here along the way. And we'll get to as many questions as we can here today. So we'd love to hear what general questions you have for the audience here today. We've got a whole variety of skill sets and backgrounds here today to cover really the whole spectrum of digital transformation and some of the different skill sets that are important to make those projects successful. And speaking of the chat, if you don't mind just dropping in the chat, what city and country are you joining from today? I always love to see where the global community is joining us from here today. So if you don't mind just dropping in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. We already have one very nice comment that I'll share with our audience and our guests here today. This is from Wirya on LinkedIn. He says, all my favorites, nice to see you all. And thank you for that comment. And these are all my favorites too, or some of my favorites, which is why I invited them all here today. So thanks for being here. So all that being said, let's jump into the conversation. Digital transformation lessons from 6 experts. I'm going to start with a question about just sort of a general question, opening things up, and then we'll sort of go down some different rabbit holes or different paths of digital transformation success. But to start, I'm going to ask you, Greg, what are some of the biggest keys to digital transformation success?
Wow, that's a big question, Eric. And Greg Benton, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Third Stage and come from about 25 years of guiding advisory as well as selection and implementation of ERP and guiding people through their entire digital transformation journey. The thing that's overlooked the most, and I think is the most critical to success, is defining the vision. So what do you really want to do with a digital transformation? And digital transformation is no longer just implementing an ERP system. Enterprise resource planning, as we have come to understand, really doesn't encompass everything that goes on within an organization as you're moving to a desired future state, right? So putting together the executive alignment up front surrounding a business plan that talks about what are your objectives for the organization as you go into this, high degree of change that you're going to enjoy on the journey, right? And also just getting to defining the roadmap and outlining that for the next 5 to 7 years for the organization. And, that's the most important part of getting started. Once you get into it, having the commitment and the dedication of your people, your organization, understanding what that vision is leading to, and getting everyone on board with the change, and then choosing the right partners in the entire journey, right? So choosing the right technology partners, making sure that you're bringing along all of the people within your organization that can make a difference, that can actually see the changes benefiting the organization and themselves, and bringing them along as part of any core team, any alignment with the steering committees. So establishing governance all the way through, and that's really a starting point. We'll get into a lot more of the details about the checklist as we go through the discussion here.
Yeah, and you mentioned the bringing the people along, bringing the human side of the equation along as part of one of the key success factors for transformation success. And that sort of leads me to a question I've got for you, Emma, to open up the people thread of things. But you're a big advocate of this people first approach to digital transformation. You talk about it all the time on TikTok, LinkedIn. You've got a good following there, and you built a company around that. Tell us a little bit about why a people first approach to digital transformation is so important.
I mean, the first thing I could say is that you just won't get adoption, and I could end there. Right. But I don't think that makes for a very entertaining show. When I look at my career, so to kind of like give everybody a background of who I am, my career started on the software sales side. And I spent about 10 years helping to lead large-scale transformations across a bunch of different industries, not on the ERP side, but I would say more on kind of a supporting role, integrating with things like policy admin solutions and insurance, ERP systems in manufacturing and commercial companies, healthcare, electronic records management. You name it, our software was a document management and workflow component that kind of integrated there. And so we were involved in these wide-scale transformations across all of these different industries. And the biggest thing that I saw that dictated whether people were going to be successful with their change was how they managed the people side of it. And we mentioned finding the right partners already, Greg. You mentioned the idea of getting the adoption and finding a way to bring people in and get them excited about the change. But even if we're like taking a step back, all of those things are driven by the humans that are involved with the project. And I feel like one of the things that we get distracted with so often when we start talking about digital transformation is that the first word is digital. But it's actually the last part of like an equation when we look at order of operations and how we need to be successful. So we have to start with people and process, and then technology comes in as that last piece. And that order of operations matters if you actually want to be successful. That doesn't mean that every single person in your organization has a say on every decision, because you wouldn't get anything done. But going back to that idea of the vision and the why, you have to be communicating that. You have to be guiding your team along your thought process so that they understand and can feel comfortable stepping into what this project is going to look like, whether that's an ERP implementation or something like a process change or everything in between. And, sometimes I will hear people say to me like, well, it's your job. Like, who's going to not use the technology that they have to use to keep their job? Well, I can promise there's been hundreds of millions of dollars lost and completely evaporated by the fact that there are a lot of people that will just find their sneaky workarounds. And the larger the company you get into, the more opportunity there is to deviate from what this new solution and this envisioned future is if you're not really intentional about getting that adoption and those people involved in the process. And I could keep going for forever and ever, but I know we've got more questions tied to this, so I'll kind of stop there for a moment.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, you're right. It's if you ignore the people side of it, it's just not going to be successful, no matter how well you did everything else. I mean, if you've got a beautifully designed system, you've got a great project plan and strategy, you've got resource commitment, you do all the things right you're supposed to do, but you ignore that one piece, and that's sort of like the Jenga game. You pull out the bottom of that Jenga puzzle, the whole thing's gonna fall over, no matter how well built you think it is.
Exactly.
Now, what about so Friska, I want to turn to you for a second, because you, like Emma, have a very similar lens that you view transformation through, as far as the people side of things. And you've recently published a book called The Future Fit Organization. Tell us what a future fit organization is, if you don't mind, after you introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody on the call. I'm Friska, behind Fresh by Friska. I've been in organizational transformation and change for over a decade now. leading change programs impacting up to 65,000 people across 6 of the 7 continents. So like Eric said, I published a book last year, which was my first one, and my second one is out later this year called The Future Fit Asian Organization, because to the points that were made earlier, it is all about the people, and it is not a cookie cutter approach. Like the approach and the strategy that I developed in Sydney is going to be very different if I was trying to implement the same change in Shanghai. And in answer to your question, a future fit organization is an organization that simply just doesn't react to change, but they're proactive. They're proactive in planning it, resourcing it, managing it, and sustaining it. If we think of what the terms mean, future means at a later date. And fitness, like its name suggests, it's building that organizational muscle. It's building that agility, that resilience, that grit, that capability that will, keep an organization bouncing forward, even though changes come unexpectedly, surprisingly, and sometimes unwelcome. Like look at COVID, for example. I kind of laugh when people say that they're future-proofing their business or they're future-proofing this. That's really, really arrogant, because even companies that had gone through very similar disasters, like Hong Kong with the SARS outbreak, etc., they were still caught completely off guard when this new virus took hold. So that's why I like to say future fit. A future fit organization is an organization that's committed to its continuous innovation and growth, and they take change seriously.
Yeah, and you and I have talked in podcast interviews in the past about how it's about how you adapt to the change, not avoiding the future, not avoiding change, but recognizing that you don't know what the change is going to be. But the key is, how do you build an organization that can adapt based on whatever happens externally and internally? So that's a super interesting concept. And I also like that you don't call it future proof, because that's always bothered me too. It's like, what does that mean? That doesn't even make sense that you'd be future proof. But yet a lot of our industry uses it for marketing purposes. So Aaron, we talked about multinational, or Friska was talking a bit about multinational projects. And you've been involved with multinational projects as well. What do you think some of the keys are to multinational transformations, and how is that different from if we're managing, just a domestic or a single location sort of transformation?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Aaron Patterson. I'm the Executive Vice President for EMEA for Third Stage Consulting. My background has been in consulting and system integration, and kind of working at a number of different companies over the years, from private equity back to startups to multinationals. And so a lot of experience working in this space. And so one of the things I think is clear is there's definitely a lot of consistency between, a local one country kind of deployment and a multinational. So things like Greg said around clear vision and strategy, real need strong leadership and governance, that counts for every single kind of implementation or digital transformation that you'd be doing. I think the other key thing is, obviously, which has already been talked about as well, is the cultural sense of sensitivity and inclusion. As you said earlier, deployments in Sydney are going to be different to Shanghai. That's absolutely true. And if you are deploying across 50 or 60 countries, and even some regional differences within those countries as well, it's incredibly important to have some local advocates and some local change agents to be able to help you with that. And then, because you are dealing with a multinational situation, effective communication is really key. And being consistent and transparent in that communication, making sure that it's both relevant for the program as a whole and for the local markets as they're doing their individual work for deployment or managing change or some of the technical implementations. I think that's probably a key thing as well. And then finally, I think probably one of the things just to touch on as well, especially today, is really around security and compliance, and just taking a mindful approach and a very structured approach to what laws and compliance you have to actually deal with in the various different countries, because that can be very different. In the US, we may have very little kind of government regulation for certain industries, and that definitely isn't the case, especially when it comes to digital data, making sure who owns it, who's got access to it, different things like that. That's different on a region and country by country basis, and taking that into account is oftentimes something that gets missed if the team is kind of doing their first international project. So those are probably some of the key things, I think.
Yeah. It makes total sense. It's a important nuance. It's a lot of the same practices you have to leverage, but on a larger scale. But also, there's a lot more complexity that comes into it organizationally and culturally, for certain. Real quick, before I ask you your first question here, Marcus, I would just want to turn to the audience real quickly. I want to thank audience members that let us know where they're from today. For example, we have Gavin on LinkedIn from Manchester, UK. Alcinda on LinkedIn from Johannesburg, South Africa. So thank you for being here today. Emma, this comment was for you actually while you were talking. Carmen on LinkedIn said, yes, she's right on point. So Carmen agrees with you as well. You've got a fan there in Carmen. Also, this one's for you, Friska. This is from Alcinda on LinkedIn. She says, the Future Fit organization is a great read. Highly recommend.
Oh, so thank you.
You could save that for your, for the inside cover of your next book. You could use it as a review for your book there. And then Carmen on LinkedIn says, yes, this is where you need to understand the environment, culture when doing implementations in other countries. You need to understand the policies and compliance policies. So great comment there and in agreement with what both you, Aaron, and Friska said there. I want to turn to you real quickly, Marcus, and bring out the elephant in the room. We've sort of talked about it. I think each of us has sort of alluded to this concept of project failure. I know none of us want to talk about it. It's highly uncomfortable, but we have to talk about it. Why do so many digital transformations fail, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, there's a multiple reasons for that. But before I get into those, my name is Marcus Harris, as Eric said. I'm an attorney practicing a law firm called Taft, and for the past, let's say, 20 years, I've really focused my career on drafting and negotiating ERP and digital transformation related agreements, and then, unfortunately, for my clients, litigating, failed digital transformation projects in courts all across the United States. And if there are a few consistent themes that we see in the lawsuits that I litigate, they really, I think, focus mostly around having unreasonable expectations. Okay. And so, and there's a variety of reasons for that. Our clients will go into these things and they'll be full of excitement. There's anxiety associated with that. They're spending a ton of money, but they haven't done any of the most basic types of due diligence. They don't know how long an implementation is supposed to take. They don't know how long the project should cost. They have no understanding of whether the budget projections that are provided by the ERP vendor, for example, or the integrator, if those are reasonable or unreasonable. And so, they go into this thing not really understanding what they are getting themselves into. And in some ways, I mean, you can say, okay, well, shame on you for that. But at the same time, I mean, I think, the goal of these ERP vendors is to sell software. And one of the ways they do that is to make it seem less complicated than it really is. They sell you on, this has got industry best practices. It's designed for your particular industry. It's going to enable industry compliance. It's off-the-shelf software, out of the box, minimal customization, and it's going to be easy for you to implement, and you're going to realize all of these business benefits from the technology. And that's often just not the case. You roll this back, and in lawsuits that I've done, we've learned, okay, well, they tell you it's designed for the industry, but the way that they got there, they had no understanding of your particular industry or your needs or your industry compliance requirements. They just kind of guessed. They sell the sizzle, right? They don't sell the steak. That's how they make their living. It's like, look at all these fancy, shiny, technology things. Don't worry about how hard it is. Just focus on all the great stuff you're going to be able to do. And that's another issue that we will see as well, is that we see customers that really lead with a technology-centric focus rather than having a well-thought-out business case for why they actually need these particular pieces of functionality or software. They just want to get the latest and greatest and move forward from there, and they think it's all going to figure itself out. And it has disastrous results typically. I mean, the failure rate for these things is, depending on the study, 70, 75 and upwards % failure rate.
Yeah, and those are just the ones we know of too. We don't always hear about the failures.
Can I add one quick thing to that?
Sure.
So this is part of why, and Eric, you've heard me last year at Stratosphere, I talked a lot about this idea, but digital literacy is like such an important part of like a transformation. And what I mean by that is having executives and employees that are involved in these initiatives that understand technology from a foundational level enough to be able to weed through all of the sales language. And I say this as a past salesperson. So I feel like I can maybe jab at this a little bit.
You came from the
But
dark
to be
side.
able to recognize that things like out of the box or off the shelf are fallacies, and be able to do things like set realistic expectations. Because if you understand the art of the possible behind technology, then you're leading from that business strategy standpoint that you mentioned and bringing in the right tools in the right places and setting the right expectations, as opposed to hoping for technology to be this silver bullet that comes in and just solves all of your problems. And when you look at like one of the key components that like unlocks that success, it's that digital literacy component, which to me is like, you know, whether you call it tech savviness or whatever that might be, that's a big part of change management, is that educational component, and making sure that we're like all using the same language, that people actually understand the definitions of the words that we're using, and that we're all like working towards the same goal, as opposed to this like weird marketing sales language over here that makes people think that they're getting one thing and setting these unrealistic expectations only to be unhappy in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very true. And I've got a follow-up question for you, Emma, along those lines. But real quickly before I do that, I meant to put this up earlier, but on my right in the corner right here is a QR code you can scan to learn about Digital Stratosphere. So all of us talking here today are among the speakers that are going to be at Digital Stratosphere, which is live in Denver, October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Of this year. You can join in person in Denver, meet us all in person, or you can join remotely, virtually as well, wherever in the world you're joining from. So scan this QR. Gosh, I cannot get that right. Scan the QR code right here, and you can see the agenda, how it's shaping up. You can see who the other speakers are. You can learn more about the event there. So be sure to check that out and scan that. You can also go to stratosphere2024.com is the website you can go to. Again, stratosphere2024.com. So just to follow up on that, Emma, and sort of building on what you just said, as well as what Marcus was saying, you opened up your first response to my question was, if you don't address the people side of change, you're going to fail. I'm paraphrasing what you said, but you basically said you're not going to succeed. Why is that? Help us understand how a lack of focus on people first, and maybe focusing too much on the technology first. How can you help us unpack how that evolves into a failure?
So Marcus just brought this idea up, but I like to call it random acts of technology. And that's like believing that if you bring in something from a technology standpoint, so like I'm going to pick on AI right now. It's got a ton of potential. There is actual benefit, and there are businesses that are figuring it out. There's a lot of businesses right now that are chasing the shiny object of IT and bringing, or shiny object of AI, and bringing it into the organization as a random act of technology. They're not looking for where they've had these like big problems that have been eluding them for years. They're looking for these use cases that they're being marketed to bring into the organization to say that they're using AI. To me, that is a broken thought process on how to lead a technology implementation of any kind, whether that's AI or any sort of other tool. What we should be doing is going back to the people that are doing the work within our organizations and spending some time understanding what are the things that they don't like about their job. Yes, there's always going to be things that we don't like about our job, even if we're using technology, but getting a better understanding of what those things are. Talking through where we have process bottlenecks or things that don't go the way that we would if, like, run the way that we would hope if we could envision the most effective and efficient process. And then when we've got this bucket of information about where our people have their problems and where our processes are not designed optimally, then we look at, okay, if we go back to our toolkit of technology, what options do we have to bring forward technology that's going to help us impact these areas of opportunity that we have. Then we have an actual project that our team has raised their hand to say, I hate this, I don't like it, my job would be a lot better if I wasn't doing this. Or your customer experience is impacted because you've improved a process, whether that's by helping the employees or just improving the efficiency of that process. And then the technology, when your team gets in and starts learning the new tools and having to change their process and get trained on new things, there is a reason behind it for them. And there's something for them to attach to. And so when you look at, and when we're focused on that vision and that vision and why means nothing if every single person that's impacted by that change can't attach to it and have some sort of what's in it for me statement. And I say this full-heartedly, being the most millennial person that's out there that won't adopt something unless I understand the why behind it. I had a boss that said that he wouldn't ask me to do anything unless he had a strong why that I was going to attach to, because he knew I just wouldn't, not because I'm difficult, but because there is so much change coming at us. So Friska, you brought this up. Things are always changing. We always have to be ready for what's coming next. And if there's not a reason for us to adopt and change, our effort and our brain space goes to all of the other things that are happening in front of us, as opposed to trying to make this meaningless change stick. And what happens if you're always leading with technology and these meaningless changes or these random acts of technology is eventually your team gets to the point where they're like, oh yeah, that process is going to be changed again in 3 weeks because it's not actually going to work. So why am I going to adopt it? I'm just going to keep doing it the way I've always done it. And maybe if they come up with a better idea, I'll try it next time. And then you end up in this cycle where your team is disenfranchised with the idea of how and where you're using technology. And they're going to make your battle about 10 times harder. That's not a scientific statistic. They're going to make your battle that much harder when you're trying to roll out the next bit of technology in your organization. And then you get into this nasty cycle of resistance and kind of this I'll believe it when I see it mentality. Or sometimes there's fear because they know that different technology is coming in with the idea to replace them. All of these things start happening when we lead with that technology approach as opposed to that people and process component.
Yeah, it's well said, and that's a good unpacking of how that unfolds, because I think people sort of throw out blanket statements oftentimes hey, if you don't focus on people, then you're going to fail. But understanding why that is, what is it? How do all these moving parts come to a crashing halt when you don't address that people side of it? And that's a good overview. What would you add to this, Friska? I know this is right up your alley as well, but as far as why a lack of focus on change management, people first, all the stuff you espouse as well, what would you add to that in terms of why that causes failure if you don't focus on those areas?
I keep it simple. I ask just one question: what percentage of your project's benefits depend on people doing things differently? Usually it's pretty sky high. It's 90%, 100%. But often the budget for technology is this big and the budget for people-related stuff is this big. So how can you expect success when you've totally got your priorities in the wrong order?
Yeah. And I think part of it too is what you guys are saying is it's, what you just said, Friska, you spend your budget this much on technology, this much on people, this much I can see. I can see the technology. I get a deliverable. I get a clear output. I know if it works or doesn't work. I can run a test scenario and look at the test script. There's so much tangible stuff to it. So it sort of makes sense that we would have that bias, hey, let's just focus on that thing that we can see. All the stuff that you and Ema are talking about, it's well, I can't see that. I can't see it and touch it and feel it in the same way. Oftentimes there's not a clear deliverable that comes out of that. Is that something you guys have seen, or how do you overcome that bias?
I think if you agree on the metrics and what success looks like early on, it's much easier to measure the success or not of change. And there's lots of different metrics. There's individual metrics, there's team metrics, there's organizational metrics. If it's a technology implementation, then it's more clear cut. It could be time completed to run a certain process. It could be reducing errors. It could be reducing calls to the support center. So lots of different things, but those metrics are very rarely agreed upon right at the beginning. And so what happens is you're kind of chasing your tail, trying to figure out how to measure this thing. Is it going well or not? when those conversations should have been happening up front.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's an interesting comment from YouTube from Sahil on YouTube. Says fully dependencies on technologies is also not good. What if it fails? Technology is used to save time and effort in industries. But I think it's interesting because technology can fail, of course, but the people will fail if you don't set them up for success. And so you've got to figure out, not only how do we make the technology work, but how do we ensure that the people are working as well? So that's a great point. I want to get to a couple other comments here because we've got some good ones that came in. This one, hopefully I can show the whole comment, or I'll show most of it here. This is from Beth on LinkedIn. Beth says, "Oh, wow, thank you for saying that. For those of us that have sold realistically for years, we lose to the sleek demos that will be quote unquote turnkey. People don't look deep enough or ask the hard questions of all vendors equally. I think having those key folks with digital literacy on board ensures they can implement and digest such solutions." So great.
Yeah, I would say as a past salesperson, it sucks to lose a deal to somebody that has lied. But I've also, as a salesperson, had those deals come back again when the project failed spectacularly the first time because of those like misleading statements or the other. And it serves you and your company far better to be honest and realistic so that you have successful project outcomes, so that you have referenceable customers and people that continue to buy from you year over year. But it definitely stinks.
Well, to do what you're saying, though, you have to be playing the long game, which it sounds like you were. And a lot of salespeople are not playing the long game. They're thinking, how am I going to hit my number for this quarter?
Oh, yeah.
I'll do whatever I need to do.
Well, and I admittedly early on in my career, I was a part of a couple of deals where like they felt like they were artificially pushed to the finish line. Not that we couldn't meet the need or that I had like been dishonest during the sales cycle, but like a discount or something was there. And so we maybe didn't do all of the things that I would typically do during a sales process to get it through to the finish line. And those were the projects that made me sleepless or made me, like spend 5 times as much effort down the line trying to make sure that that customer ended up happy and that we worked through what we needed to work through in terms of communication or any of the things that were missed during that sales cycle. And learning that lesson and actually like pulling those lessons through to the rest of my career helped a lot because I didn't ever want to have even a doubt in my stomach when something was being signed that there was like some weird question mark, because those weird question marks always came back up. And so the better that you could do with that long game of like maybe taking a little bit longer with that sales cycle, well, guess what? Maybe that deal ends up being bigger because there is more professional services associated with it because you've dug deeper on how to make it successful, and you end up in a better place from like a company standpoint, from a revenue standpoint, but also again with those happy customers.
Yeah, I think that stuff is incredibly important, and hats off to ethical salespeople and ethical vendors. And my kind of reference point's a little bit skewed because we sue vendors, right? So we're not seeing a lot of the good stuff; we're seeing the bad stuff. And I've seen sales guys will say, well, I told them that the software had this feature and functionality, and it's true because it's just a matter of how much are we going to modify it and how much do they want to spend. So the software can do almost anything. The question is, how much do you want to pay for it, right? And they don't tell you that part though. They'll tell you, oh yeah, it can do this, this, and this. It's not base functionality. It's not out of the box. They may not even tell you that. And so, you're almost set up for failure, right from the start because of the push to get the deal done.
Yeah.
It does have to be a sales process though, right? You have to have resources that are motivated to show exactly how the software is going to work with your operations, with your organization. And Marcus, you hit on in the very beginning, one of the reasons for failure is because people don't adequately test the idea about how will the systems work within my organization. Ema and Friska, you're talking about the people side of it. There's also the need to unify the people, the process, and the technology components, right? And I'm getting a little ahead of myself here on the different steps to making that all come together. But entering into a phase 0, in other words, getting the organization prepared to move forward, as well as understanding what your options are up front or even in the middle of your journey. If you're in the middle of an implementation and you need to slow down and back off, find out what is going on with that implementation and get back to the basics. What are our objectives? What is the strategy? What is the vision for the organization? How do we get everybody on board with going forward? And a lot of people, a lot of organizations skip that step in bringing people, process, and technology together. So,
yeah, great point. And you must have been reading my script of questions here, Greg, because that was my next question here was for you, and it was about phase zero. So I must have shared these questions. They must have leaked out in advance because you seem to have a good segue there. So you talked about
a thoughtful leak.
Yeah, it's a good segue. So you mentioned phase zero, and you just explained the importance of it. But help us understand, what is phase zero? When you talk about phase zero, what does that mean, and how does it impact a project?
Well, it is really getting back to the organization's preparedness to move into what is going to be a huge change to the organization. It's also some of the opportunity to change processes. So adopt new processes, higher optimization with the software or the technology system that you're going to put in place. And many organizations look at a kind of spot solution. They're looking for enterprise resource planning for finance and supply chain. They're not looking at the whole organization, the way that it's going to interoperate, the way that it's going to react to a new software system that's driving toward incredible growth or competitive advantage within their marketplace, their environment, taking better care of their people, achieving their missions in healthcare and public sector. A lot of those things don't come together in a cohesive manner. And internally or with external partners, there's a need to put together an enterprise program management. And the program extends to all of the digital systems within the organization, right? That digital enterprise operations picture, and establishes governance and really an idea about what this is going to cost, how it's going to affect the organization, and what are the value and advantages that we're going to receive as a return on that investment at the end. So that is phase zero. It's looking at your data and finding out how big is the lift going to be into the new technology, and then mitigating even the length of the implementation by making sure that the organization is all aligned with the new project that's coming forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And you and I, Greg, have talked about this before, about how it's sort of like if you go to build a house, you're not just going to bring in the plumber on day one and say, okay, come start building this house. You're going to take the time up front to hire an architect and a general contractor, create the vision of what the house is going to be. But oftentimes what happens is the plumbers, which, in this metaphor would be the software vendors, they convince you just to hire them to come in and start building stuff. And so you build the plumbing, but it doesn't match what it is you need as an organization. And so, if you view these projects, even though these projects are hard to touch and feel like, unlike a house or a building that you might be building, you have to view it that way and think about, well, what would you do if you were building a building? You wouldn't do what most organizations do in digital transformations. What they should be doing is taking that time up front. And that's what phase zero is. And it also addresses a lot of what everyone else has been talking about here today. Marcus talks about, making sure you cut through the sizzle to get to the steak. That's an example of something you can do during phase zero. Certainly the people side of it that Ema and Friska are talking about is something you can define up front in phase zero, the change strategy, and how are we going to impact the organization? How can we move people along and bring them along the way? So that's great stuff. I want to ask you a question though, Aaron, coming back to this concept of multinational organizations. I know a lot of people listening are part of multinational companies, but when we're dealing with multinational projects, what are some of the best ways to draw in key stakeholders and align cultures or address the fact there are multiple cultures within an organization? How do we address all that from a multinational implementation perspective?
Time and focus, I think. Strategies aren't too dissimilar. I think, you want early and inclusive engagement. You really want to focus on the tailored communication like we talked about before. There's just different levels of it in a multinational kind of organization and deployment than there would be. I think it's key to establish local champions so you do have a voice in all of the regions that you go and do. I think in a lot of cases, it's good practice to have some cultural training, some awareness, making sure that the team is actually aware. And then as the project goes on, really make sure that you do have collaborative decision making, right? Because you don't want people who are not in the home country or whatever, the home office, to feel kind of on the outside of their own project. You want everybody to be involved in that, and that includes making sure that you have good feedback loops there, right? And what is going well, making sure that you do get feedback from all of the interested parties that you're working with. And then one of the things I've seen that really makes a big difference is, you do have the overall project vision and strategy and what is this going to do for the business, but you really have to make sure that you're going to allow for local adoption of those global strategies. There has to be some flexibility. If you go in and you're deploying to 20 countries and there's no flexibility in the types of work and the individual deployments in those regions, you're going to have a hard time getting adoption for those and being able to have the flexibility. And at a very base level, it's even just government compliance, right? Making sure that you can do the local compliance and cover that, but then making sure that you're adapting the actual implementation itself. If there's different systems that we're integrating to in different countries, a lot of times, we were talking a couple of weeks ago to a company that had offices in a bunch of different places, and they had a system that was working fantastically well for them in Scandinavia. It worked okay for them in Spain, but in South America, it just didn't work at all because of some of the compliance and because of some of the cultural differences and how people use the different systems. And so replacing that with one system is possible, but you do have to have a bit of flexibility there. You can't go in and be inflexible in your deployment rules and the actual functionality as well. So.
Yeah, and finding that balance of how much do we want to standardize onto a common platform versus leave things somewhat decentralized and independent of one another.
Especially if the business case is built on that standardization, right? That's the hard thing. On the one hand, you've got the financial drivers behind the project, but as we've talked about earlier, right, the financial drivers don't mean anything if the end users don't actually adopt the system and use it. They may as well just set the money on fire in the parking lot. Right. So that's right. You have to get the balance. Yes, you have goals to be completely standard throughout the whole organization, but is that ever going to be successful? And if not, where do you have to make and allow the changes to have both a project that meets your overall strategic goals, but then is actually adopted and used, because you'll never get the first without the second.
Right. Yeah, very, very well said. I want to come back here to a couple comments. This is from Will on LinkedIn. Will says, go-getters tend to want to bypass the planning phase and get right to work. Pre-planning is critical for any project, but especially digital transformation, as it touches all employees and facets of your business. And this is a really good point. I'm glad Will said this because, I think the fact that we do tend to bypass a lot of what Greg and even what you were just saying, Aaron, the reason we tend to want to bypass this is because we're so excited. The momentum's high. We picked this new software. Finally, we have a vision to get rid of our old crappy systems and things are going to be great. So let's just jump in and start building stuff. And so you end up bypassing that phase zero, thinking that if I do phase zero, that's going to slow me down. Why do that when I can just jump in and start doing stuff? And I would argue, and we've seen it time and time again, if you do that, you're going to take a lot longer. It's going to cost you a lot more than if you just take a little bit of time up front to do the phase zero, get a plan in place, have a solid blueprint, and then start building stuff. But I think Will's point is a good one, which is people's intentions are good. I don't think people want to screw these projects up. They're not setting out to screw this up. They think they're doing the right thing, and there's usually good intentions behind it.
Will has just put the exclamation point on your analogy of building a house and inviting the plumber to come in and do their work first, right?
Yeah. I want a house with
Let's get building.
Yeah, exactly. I want a house with running water, so let's go get the plumber and bring that over. Here's a interesting comment. This is from Horatio on YouTube. Says, "I'm sorry, my people. The conversation's great, but my nephew just had a baby as we speak, so I'm going to go see the digital transformation of processing the new baby's kidney." So that's the beauty of these live streams.
Right. We can't compete with biologic transformation. I mean, we just can't.
But,
it's baby cuteness. We can't compete with that.
Yeah, baby cuteness. Well, we'll expect to see pictures, Horatio, of your baby's cuteness there, your nephew's baby's cuteness. So you get it all here on this live stream. That's what I love about it. You get everything. You get digital transformation. You get cute little babies. I mean, what next? So good. Here's another comment I just want to point out because I think it underscores maybe the root cause of some of the challenges we're talking about. This is from Sahil on YouTube. And Sahil says, sales comes with a target here in India. If you achieve it, then the next target is even higher, but the person's salary remains the same. And setting aside different compensation plans and cultures throughout the world, if you just look in general, you have to look at incentives. And that's a big part of what I think, Marcus, you were alluding to is what's the incentive of the people that are trying to sell to you. And you have to just recognize it, take it with a grain of salt. Or, it is what it is. You're not going to change that. But what you can do is kind of see through that and understand that this person's trying to make a sale. So let me dig a little deeper so I can work through that. That's sort of self-interest to make sure we're representing our own interests.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, your interests and the vendor's interests are really kind of at odds at some points in the relationship. And, the whole goal of going through that contractual negotiation process is to put everything on the table so that you guys are very much reading from the same hymnal and understand, these are my obligations, these are your obligations, this is how it's going to go. And then to have some sort of a resolution process when things go off the rails, because they inevitably will go off the rails. And especially if you haven't done any of the things that we've been talking about today and what Will was just talking about, this phase 0 and the planning and the process.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit to the idea, though, of those salespeople with integrity and how you manage it. And Eric, you've heard me say this a number of times. My background is actually in education. I was a teacher. A big part of the philosophy of the company that my husband and I run is that the best salespeople are teachers. And so if you can adopt that mentality, yes, you might be competing with people that are making false promises. But if you take the role of your prospects or your customers' favorite teacher and teach them how to make these buying decisions and teach them about all the things that we've been talking about, you build your authority and you build trust. And people buy based off of trust. Yes, they buy based off of price tag, but if they trust that you are going to be that actual advisor for them through that process, they are more likely to buy from you. And then again, the outcomes of your project are more successful. So for any of the salespeople that might be on this, start thinking through how you can educate all of your prospects and your buyers on the things that we've been talking about. Big tool that I used when I was selling was teaching about digital literacy. That's how my TikTok got started. That's how a lot of my content on LinkedIn is about that idea of breaking down these ideas or these terms that we use to mystify people so that they can make better buying decisions. And then when the time comes and they need help, you've taught them something and they trust you and they'll come back to you. So there is a different way, I promise.
Yeah. Well, and that's a great point, Emma, because I totally agree. Just in general, I agree with you, but I agree with you even more if you look at the last 2 or 3 years in our industry, because I would argue that our industry has the highest degree of distrust that I've ever seen. I mean, because you have a lot of software vendors that are sort of forcing these migrations, at least in the ERP space. A lot of these incumbent vendors like SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, they're all sort of pushing their customers off the legacy systems into the cloud, which is fine. That's where we're going as a industry. But the problem I have is that now you're giving arbitrary deadlines to your customers to say, if you don't get off this old system and upgrade to the new one, we're just going to stop supporting you. And so you're sort of coming into this with a lack of trust. And we see a lot of people that come to us at third stage, they're looking to us to provide some trust and honesty because they're seeing a lot of garbage in the space. And so I think what you're saying is absolutely spot on, Emma. The people that do build trust, they stand out in not a sore thumb in a bad way, but they stick out like a sore thumb in a good way. So I think it's a great point.
A happy thumb, not a sore
I'd
one.
There's got to be a better
comment too. One of the reasons that we host Stratosphere every year is to impart some of this understanding the pitfalls that people can avoid when going through this entire digital transformation process. I was sitting next to a client last year that turned to me during one of Marcus's sessions and said, "Gosh, I wish I'd known about this. I wish I'd thought about it before we ever went into it. We would have completely renegotiated the contracts that we ended up signing." So that goes to Emma's point too. I mean, software vendors, they want to do the right thing. They want to be the partner of choice for you. But you have to make sure that the boundaries are set on both sides with that contractual agreement. So,
yeah. And again, Stratosphere 2024, you can scan the QR code here or go to stratosphere2024.com if you want to learn more about it. Marcus does talk in the sessions. He typically will talk about some of these contractual considerations. And speaking of that, Marcus, could you give us a preview of what you'll be talking about at Stratosphere in terms of some of the contractual considerations that a project team or an organization needs to consider when they're embarking on a software purchase and transformation?
I like to kind of break it down and be practical in the way that I approach these presentations and really the issues that I think people need to focus on, because I think from a pure legal perspective, and I'm not going to go overly legal right now because I think everybody's going to fall asleep. But it's always the things that we always focus on are, as lawyers in these agreements. It's warranties, limitations and liabilities, indemnities, remedies, damages. All those things are incredibly important, and you have to focus on those, and that's a given, right? But when you're embarking upon a digital transformation or an ERP implementation project, you really have to think about the people aspect of this and what can you do to set reasonable expectations, which is what the contract negotiation process is actually for. It's to, like I said before, you put everything on the table and you make sure that you have a meeting of the minds as to what is going to happen and who's responsible for it. But then you have to really go a step further, and I think you need to really use the tools in your contractual toolbox to manage the relationship for the duration of the implementation project or the integration project, and for the life cycle of your relationship with that particular vendor. And for me, there's no better contract or more important contract in this whole ERP package than I think the consulting agreement, the master services agreement, whatever you want to call it, it's called different things, and the statements of work that are going to kind of flow from that agreement. And those documents are the documents to some extent that I think become important because they manage the deliverables, the milestones, the schedules, the testing, what happens when you reject something. Those documents need to have a large degree of particularity so that you can leverage those to manage the implementation integration process going forward. And so to me, it's just nuts and bolts kinds of things. What are you buying? What's the software? What's the name of the software? It can't just be SAP software, right? It's got to have, the modules, the functionality, all it needs to be detailed. Who's going to be on the project team? You don't need to know the names, but you need to know the roles. How are you going to be able to replace them when something goes wrong? How are the meetings going to take place? How often are we going to get project status updates? All of those things can be addressed in the statements of work, and they should be addressed. And we see vendors push back on that degree of granularity. Agile development, software development methodology or implementation methodology, which it really isn't, is kind of the bane of my existence because it doesn't allow you to do any of that detail. And so we see that on a pretty regular basis. But then, even these kinds of documents have limitations because they're very much fixed in time, right? They're fixed in time as far as, when you kind of know, you think what's going on. But as that project moves forward, things change, and you've got to have some sort of a dynamic process built in with change order procedures. You want to have a good, solid project plan, which isn't necessarily a contract, but you've got to have a holistic kind of view of all the different moving parts and pieces, and make sure they all function together, and make sure that you've got contractual remedies if something does go wrong. Because you want to, the goal, I say this a lot, is you want to open up your desk drawer, pull the contract out, and you want to be able to point that at them and say, okay, this is what you need to do. This is the problem here. This is actually a complaint. So you don't want to pull this document out because it's a lawsuit. but you want to pull a contract out, this is here's a statement of work. So that's the one you want to pull out and be able to point to it and say, this is what you're supposed to do, and this is what happens when the deliverables don't work.
Yeah, very well said. You want to have that well documented, and that's a great way to get everyone on the same page as well. So just to sort of close things or bring it all full circle here, I'll start with you, Friska, on this one. But how do you create an organizational culture that is more accepting of change?
I think why people don't trust organizations, vendors, whatever, it's because there is a lack of trust. We've talked about the lack of trust. And if you want to build that trust, your actions need to match your words. So a lot of organizations claim that they want to be innovative, they want to grow, they want to transform, they want to change. But do they celebrate failure? No. Do they celebrate failure as a stepping stone to progress? No. So I would suggest establish what I call a fail forward policy. So there's a company in Berlin that does this very well. It's called Buffer. And every Friday, it's called F Up Fridays, where literally everybody in the team takes turns to celebrate a monumental F up. But it's not, crying and saying, oh my God, it didn't work. It's what did you learn from it? That is the important part. So turning it on its head. So have a monthly failure celebration day. So I actually implemented this in my comms plan for a previous client. So, everybody always shares success stories, case studies. I shared failure fables and learning logs. So yeah, reversing that and really embedding that growth mindset, that learning mindset. I also introduced something called change sabbaticals, where, as its name suggests, you encourage employees to take time off from their regular day job and they work on something completely different. Maybe it's a change-related project. Maybe it's a completely different role or different department. So this not only helps break down silos, but it encourages cross-functional understanding and it helps really spark new ideas. So those are my two go-tos for trying to encourage people to be more accepting of change within organizations.
Yeah. Well, and that understanding that others fail, it sort of brings you closer to people. It's like, oh, we're all just human. We all do F up at times, and that's okay. That's really interesting perspective there. So, well, this is great. I know we can talk for hours, and I would love to. It would be a fun exercise. But in the interest of time, we'll wrap it up here. But real quickly, just as a closing a question for a couple of you here. I'll start with you, Greg, on this sort of bonus question. But what are you most looking forward to at Stratosphere, or what have you most enjoyed at past Stratospheres? You've been to several now.
The exchange of ideas. So you have people that are just a phenomenal group of technologists on the software vendor side that tell about what is coming next, how they are tackling AI in the ecosystem, as an example. And we put together a marvelous group of people last year that just really came to understand how to make things better when they returned to their organizations and they continued with their digital transformations, or even just change management as really a focus. That's what you can hope to gain from this. Very honest and telling relation of exactly how people are doing things right, and to Friska's point, how people are doing things wrong. So celebrating that F Up Friday, I guess. But
yeah, and also the peers, just having other people that are in the same shoes as organizations that are going through this change. I find that, they learn just as much from each other as they do from some of the great speakers we have there. So it's great to hear from all six of us and all the other speakers we're going to have there. But there's something about just commiserating or exchanging ideas peer to peer that's super powerful. And it's actually really fun to watch. I enjoy it. And that's where I learn the most too, is just by listening to two CIOs in the hallway talking about their projects or whatever. How about you, Marcus? What is it? Taft Law has sponsored every Stratosphere we've done from the very first one back in 2018. So tell us what you most enjoy about it and what you hope to get out of it.
Yeah, we find a lot of value in this particular conference, and it really is the educational experience that I get personally from the other speakers, the nuance, just kind of the 360 view that you get, because, as an attorney, you're kind of siloed as far as, your participation in the process. And it helps me to really provide more well-rounded advice to my clients as they're going through this process. And I think, it's the learning experience from certainly the speakers, but then learning from the attendees. And, one of the things that you guys have been really good about is highlighting, customer successes, and they tell why they were successful. They talk about the challenges that they've faced, and so that's always a good learning experience as well. And I always enjoy the networking events and the bands and the parties. So it's a fun time as well.
Yes. We have an 80s tribute band, which is amazing.
You're gonna say calling out Eric's love for 80s music.
Yeah, you didn't see the wall behind me here.
Don't forget the band. Yep.
Yeah. Clearly, I love 80s rock, and there is an 80s tribute band that'll be there that Thursday night. But it is great networking. It's a lot of fun. We try to pack in a lot of content, but we also try to pack in a lot of networking and fun and good food as well. So hopefully you can join. And again, if you can't be there in person, you can also join virtually, and you can hear all 6 of us, as well as about a dozen other speakers that'll be there. So be sure to join. Again, you can scan this QR code right here, stratosphere2024.com, or just scan the QR code right next to me. Want to thank you guys for being here. This was a great conversation. Really appreciate you all being here. Maybe what I'll do real quickly, at least for Ema, Marcus, and Friska, tell us one last time how to connect with you guys, name of your company, all that good stuff. I'll start with you, Ema.
So my company's name is Roloff Consulting, which is my last name. So if you look me up on LinkedIn, I'm nice and easy to find. The tricky part is Ema is with one M. And then from there, in my LinkedIn profile, there's a little link tree that you can get access to all the other things as well.
Okay, great. And then Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, the same for me. I mean, it's Marcus Harris. You look me up on LinkedIn at Taft Law. And all my links are up there. You can go to taftlaw.com, and there's a lot of resources on our webpage. But yeah, reach out, please.
And then Friska, how do we get a hold of you?
LinkedIn, same. Company name is Fresh by Friska. Website is also of the same name, and you'll see all the links to all my socials there.
Great. And then for Aaron, Greg, and I, Third Stage Consulting, we're all part of Third Stage Consulting. You can go to thirdstage-consulting.com. We're an independent and tech agnostic consulting company that helps companies with their digital transformation and ERP implementation. So hope to see you all at Stratosphere. I know I will see all 5 of you at Stratosphere, but hope to see the audience at Stratosphere as well in October. Thanks again for being here, guys. This was a great conversation. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. And we'll look forward to chatting with you soon. So have a great week, and we will